The nights on the Darrow plantation were not quiet, they whispered. The creak of old wood, the moan of chained men, and the muffled sobs of a woman forced to watch. In Georgia, 1838, beneath cypress shadows, a marriage died, and something darker took its place. The Darrow plantation stood like a cathedral of cruelty, isolated by a sea of white cotton that swayed under the weight of southern heat. Built in 1822, its walls were thick with secrets, the kind that turned whispers into ghosts. Colonel Silas Darrow, a former militia officer turned plantation magnate, ran the estate with a cold precision that made his wealth grow as fast as his reputation for ruthlessness. Inside, the scent of magnolia mixed with the sour tang of iron from the fields. Servants moved like shadows, careful not to meet his gaze. His wife, Evelyn, moved slower each year, her pale face veiled behind manners and forced smiles. For 15 years, she had failed to give Silas a child, a wound that festered in him like a curse. In public, he called her his delicate rose. In private, he spoke to her like a servant. She prayed in the evenings, her voice trembling under the weight of his silence. When neighbors asked why she seldom left the estate, Silas claimed her health was delicate. In truth, he did not let her. The Darrows' isolation became their sickness. Every night, Evelyn would sit by the upper window, watching the slaves return from the fields, their backs bent, their chains glinting under torchlight. She noticed the way Silas's eyes lingered too long on them, especially the younger women. There was hunger there, not for labor, but something baser, unspoken. Then came the night of the storm, the one that changed everything. The thunder cracked across the fields, and Evelyn heard something through the floorboards below. Not pain, not work, but laughter. Her husband's voice, low, commanding. Another voice, softer, pleading. When she crept to the stairs, she saw the lamplight flicker beneath the parlor door, and shadows moving in ways no wife should ever see. She did not scream, she only watched. And in that moment, she understood. Her husband had found a new way to create heirs, one that did not require her. If you lived in that house, would you have looked away, or done something worse? Evelyn. Darrow was 35 when the town physician finally whispered the word she feared. Barren. He said it with pity, but pity felt like mockery. She left his office with a numbness that reached her bones. When Silas learned, he didn't speak for 3 days, then began calling her useless at the supper table. Her nights filled with whispers she could not silence, the laughter of house slaves downstairs, the rhythm of footsteps in forbidden corridors, and Silas's voice echoing through the wood like a ghost she couldn't banish. The house itself began to change, taking on a rhythm that pulsed with his cruelty. She began seeing things, a ribbon left on the floor, the imprint of a body on the parlor couch, the faint cry of a newborn drifting through her dreams. Whether real or imagined, it no longer mattered. Evelyn had become a witness, trapped between morality and madness. When the preacher came by in spring, Silas offered him bourbon and bragged about his growing household. Evelyn smiled beside him, fingers trembling against her glass. The preacher assumed he meant workers, but Evelyn knew better. She had seen the women with swollen bellies, carrying her husband's cruelty under their hearts. At night, she would stand at the nursery that was never used, the cradle untouched, the walls yellowing with dust. She prayed for death, but it never came. Instead, she began to hear the children crying in her head, ones that were not hers, born in the quarters, behind the cotton fields. Something broke inside her the night Silas made her sit beside him as one of the women gave birth. "Watch," he whispered, his voice low and vile. "You'll see what I've made." Evelyn sat still, pale as ash as the screams filled the air, and the child emerged, crying with the sound of vengeance. From that night forward, she stopped praying. She began writing, letters, journals, confessions, pages of truth no one would believe. But one day, those pages would be found, soaked with tears, sealed in blood. Tell me in the comments, was it madness that drove her, or justice waiting to be born? By the summer of 1838, the plantation began to change in ways even the field hands dared not speak of. Infants' cries echoed through the cabins more often, the nights restless with the sound of life that had no place in the silence of slavery. These were not ordinary births, not to those who watched them arrive under the watchful eyes of the overseer and the master himself. Colonel Silas Darrow had begun what he called the renewal. To him, it was an act of control, the forging of a bloodline from those he deemed fit, though none had chosen to bear it. Every child was a symbol of power, not of family. They were tallied, branded into memory as property, the moment they drew breath. The women were broken, long before their bodies healed. Silas walked the quarters like a priest among his parishioners, inspecting his creation. He believed these children carried his redemption, that through them his name would live untainted. But beneath that delusion festered something uglier: fear. He feared his wife's silence more than her words. Evelyn no longer wept. She moved through the house like a wraith, her white dresses drifting past candle flames, her face unreadable. She had seen one of the children once, a boy with her husband's sharp jaw, his skin the color of bronze sunlight. The sight left her. Trembling, that night, she entered the quarters uninvited, stepping through the damp earth and smoke to see what he had built. The mothers turned away. Some spat at her feet. One woman, barely 20, whispered, "You watching now? He make you watch?" Evelyn said nothing. But when she met the boy's eyes, she felt something break. Not pity, not rage. Something deeper, an ancient grief that swallowed words whole. When she returned to the mansion, she tore the drapes down and smashed the porcelain cradle that had waited for her own child. Silas found her sitting among the ruins, her fingers bleeding, her voice calm. "Do you hate me now?" he asked. She looked up at him and whispered, "No, Silas, I pity you." He struck her, once, twice, and left her in the dark. But that night he dreamt of her voice echoing through the house, whispering from the walls, from the fields, from the cries of his children. From that night on, none of those infants ever reached their second birthday. Would you have believed it was coincidence, or something that finally began to haunt him back? Autumn came early that year, bringing a strange stillness over the Darrow plantation. The fields wilted too soon, as if the soil itself recoiled from what had been buried beneath it. The overseers whispered that the master had brought a curse upon his land, that the cotton no longer bloomed pure, but stained gray under moonlight. Evelyn felt it too. The nights had changed. The wind carried sounds she couldn't name. Soft crying, faint and rhythmic, rising from beneath the old parlor floor. At first she thought it was memory, the echo of the births Silas forced her to watch. But then it came again, clearer, sharper. A child's cry. She lit a candle and pressed her ear to the boards. The sound was there, small and desperate, coming from deep within the house itself. When she told Silas, he laughed, a short, joyless sound. "You hear ghosts because you want to," he said. "This house doesn't grieve with you." But at night he too began to stir, the creak of steps, the sound of something dragging. Once he thought he saw a figure, a child, standing at the end of the hall, eyes wide, mouth open as if mid-scream. When he blinked, it was gone. The slaves whispered that the spirits of the dead infants had returned. Some said the earth beneath the house had swallowed them, not buried in the quarters, but hidden under the mansion itself, where Silas ordered the weak and sickly ones taken. Evelyn did not want to believe it, but one night she followed the sound down to the cellar. The air was thick with mold and rust. She carried a lantern and saw the dirt uneven, small mounds pressed into the floor, each no larger than a cradle. There were dozens, some marked with stones, some unmarked altogether. Her hand trembled as she traced a name carved faintly into the wall. Darrow. Not the master's name, but written in a child's scrawl. When she returned upstairs, her dress was torn, her face white as ash. Silas asked where she'd been. She only said, "I met your children." From that night, the house never slept. Doors slammed without wind. The cries grew louder, and even the dogs refused to enter. The slaves began lighting candles by their doors at night, whispering prayers from forgotten tongues. One morning, Evelyn found muddy footprints beside her bed, small ones, leading to the window and vanishing into the dawn mist. Tell me in the comments, if you heard the crying beneath your home, would you dig or pray it stopped? By winter of 1838, the Darrow plantation had grown quieter, not peaceful, but tense, as though the air itself feared what it might carry. The slaves no longer sang in the fields, and the overseer, Henry Pike, had begun drinking before sunrise. His eyes, once sharp with obedience, now carried a tremor. He had seen too much. Henry was not a cruel man by choice, only by profession. Silas had hired him years earlier, when Pike's debts made him desperate. But lately, something in him had broken. The sight of Evelyn wandering through the fields at dusk, white dress dragging through the dirt like a ghost, had unstrung what was left of his sanity. One night, after a storm split an oak near the slave quarters, Pike came to Evelyn's door. Rain clung to his hat. His hands shook as he held a small, leather-bound notebook, stained, frayed, and heavy with guilt. "Ma'am," he whispered, "I can't carry it no more." Evelyn opened the book by candlelight. Inside were names, the women Silas had taken, the dates, and beneath each a single cruel mark, a cross beside those who died giving birth. Near the last pages, the handwriting changed. Cruder, as if written in haste. Master said bury them under the east wing, where the wood won't rot. Her hands went cold. She looked up at Pike, whose eyes darted toward the ceiling. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she asked. He nodded. "The crying, the little feet, they come at night, same as you said." His voice cracked. "I seen the ground move once, ma'am, like the house breathing." Before she could respond, a sound cut through the storm outside. A thud, heavy and deliberate, from upstairs. Pike's face drained of color. "He's awake," he muttered, and turned to leave. But Silas was already standing in the doorway, soaked from rain, a pistol in his hand. His eyes burned with the look of a man whose secrets had been touched. "You been talking to my wife?" Pike stammered. "Sir, The gunshot shattered the silence. Evelyn screamed as the overseer fell, the notebook scattering across the floor, its pages fluttering like dying birds. Silas wiped the blood from his cheek, turned to his wife, and said softly, "Now you see what truth costs." But that night, as he dragged the body toward the cellar, he heard it too, the low cry of a child echoing through the floor, followed by a whisper that chilled his bones. "We're still here. Would you have burned the house, or stayed to listen?" 3 nights after Henry Pike's death, the plantation began to rot from the inside. The air hung thick with a copper taste, and the lamps would not stay lit. Evelyn stopped sleeping entirely. Her eyes grew hollow, her hands trembling as though gripped by a fever that had no cure. She heard the whispers constantly now, not from beneath, but from within the walls themselves. Silas refused to acknowledge any of it. He kept the house, lit with torches, muttering prayers he hadn't spoken since childhood, but guilt gnawed at him in quiet moments. He felt eyes on him even when he was alone, small, unseen eyes that moved with the shifting of the floorboards. Once, while shaving, he caught a reflection behind him in the mirror, a child's face, pale, half-formed, watching. When he turned, there was nothing but candle smoke. That evening, Evelyn made her choice. She went to the cellar with a lamp, a flask of bourbon, and a box of matches. Her steps echoed through the damp air, and when she reached the east wall, she began to pour the liquor slowly, whispering to the mounds beneath her feet. "Rest now," she said. "You don't belong to him anymore." She struck the first match. It flickered, hissed, then died. The flame refused to catch. She tried again, again. Each one died in her hand before it touched the floor. The air grew colder with each failure, as though something beneath her drew breath. Soft, deliberate, patient. Then faintly, she heard it. No fire. Evelyn dropped. the matchbox and fled, stumbling up the stairs into the hallway. The walls pulsed with low knocks, rhythmic, like heartbeats. Upstairs, Silas shouted her name, his boots pounding the floor. "What have you done?" he roared. But before she could answer, every lamp in the house went out at once. Darkness swallowed everything. In that darkness, Evelyn heard the children, dozens of voices, whispering, crying, calling her name. "Mother," they said, again and again. Then came the smell, not of smoke, but of decay. The air was heavy with it, seeping from the floor, the walls, the very foundation. Silas stumbled into the parlor with his pistol drawn. He lit a match, one that flared violently, as if the house itself had been waiting for it. The flame jumped high, blue at the edges, casting shapes along the ceiling, small hands, pressed outward, reaching from inside the walls. He screamed her name again, but Evelyn was already gone, swallowed by the dark or by something older that had awakened beneath the house. Tell me, if the dead asked you not to burn their prison, would you listen? The morning after the failed fire, sunlight touched the Darrow plantation like an intruder, faint, unwanted, unable to penetrate the gloom that clung to the walls. The servants refused to enter the main house. They left food on the steps, crossed themselves, and whispered that the mistress had vanished into the night. Only Silas remained inside, pacing the halls with the look of a man surrounded by invisible eyes. He searched for her everywhere, the cellar, the attic, even the fields where the graves swelled like bruises beneath the soil. But Evelyn was nowhere. Only her scent lingered, lavender and candle wax, mixed with something metallic. He began sleeping in the nursery, surrounded by the ghosts of what he'd never had, toys untouched, dust gathering over a cradle that had never rocked. It was there that he found the mirror. It stood against the far wall, draped in a white sheet. He had forgotten it existed, though Evelyn had once called it the only thing in this house that tells the truth. When he lifted the sheet, the glass shimmered faintly, warped with age. His reflection looked back, hollow-eyed, gray, trembling. But behind him, the reflection showed something more. A child, small still, standing in the corner of the nursery, its skin pale as wax, its eyes dark as soil after rain. Silas turned. Nothing there. When he looked back, the reflection had multiplied. 2 children, then 3, each one closer. He stumbled backward, grabbing the pistol he'd left on the dresser, but when he raised it, the gun's barrel appeared to bend in the mirror's surface, twisting into a shape that resembled a small, reaching hand. Then came the voices, faint at first, then growing louder, overlapping, whispering from inside the glass. "Father," they said, over and over, their tone neither loving nor angry, simply hungry. He struck the mirror with the pistol's butt. The glass cracked, but instead of shattering, it bled, thin rivulets of dark fluid running down its face. From within, something moved. Fingers, child-sized, pressing against the other side as if testing the barrier between worlds. Silas fled the room, his heart pounding, his breath ragged. The next morning, the mirror was back in its place, spotless, unbroken. But on the cradle's wooden rim, a message had been carved in a small, shaky hand. "We are his children. We want her back." He locked the nursery and never entered again. Yet every night he heard knocking from behind that door. Soft, rhythmic, like little fists demanding to be let out. Would you have stayed in that house another night? Or left everything to burn? Winter fell heavy on the Darrow estate. The cotton fields froze in silence. The workers moved like shadows, and the house itself groaned beneath the weight of something that refused to stay buried. Silas Darrow no longer ventured beyond the porch. He drank his bourbon by the fire and stared into the flames as if they might tell him what had become of his wife. But she was not gone. She returned on the 12th night of frost, when the moon hung thin as a blade and the wind carried the scent of wet earth. The dogs began howling first, long before the clock struck 2. Then came the sound of the front door creaking open, though no one had touched it. The servants who peeked through the windows swore they saw her, standing in the doorway, barefoot, her white nightdress streaked with mud, her hair hanging in clumps like damp moss. Evelyn Darrow had come home. Silas descended the staircase, slowly, pistol in hand, eyes wide. She stood by the hearth, motionless, her face pale but peaceful. "You," he breathed, his voice trembling with something between rage and disbelief. "You should be dead." She looked up at him and smiled. "Should I?" Her voice was soft, but it carried through the entire house. The flames in the fireplace bent toward her as she stepped forward. Silas staggered back, the pistol shaking in his grip. "Where did you go?" he asked. "I went where your children sleep," she said simply. "They told me what you did." He fired, once, twice. The shots echoed like thunder, but she did not fall. The bullets passed through her, embedding into the wall behind. She stepped closer. The air grew colder with each step, her eyes glowing faintly, not white, not blue, but the color of old ice. "Evelyn, please," he whispered. She tilted her head. "You called them yours," she said, her voice breaking like glass. "Now they want a father's love." The wind burst through the windows, the lamps shattered, and the voices of children filled the hall. Hundreds of whispers calling his name, overlapping, laughing, crying. Silas turned to run, but the door slammed shut before he could reach it. Evelyn lifted her hand, and the boards beneath his feet began to groan. He screamed as something pulled him down, small hands, countless and cold, dragging him toward the cellar through cracks that widened like jaws. The earth swallowed, his voice whole. When dawn came, the house was silent again. Only the wind moved through it. But those who passed by swore they saw her silhouette still standing in the window, staring toward the fields, waiting for someone who would never return. If you saw her there, would you wave or keep walking? When February arrived, the neighboring plantations noticed the silence first. The Darrow place, once alive with the clatter of wagons and the call of overseers, now lay still beneath a film of frost. The chimney no longer smoked. No one came to town for supplies. Even the birds had abandoned the trees near the property. After a week of unease, 3 men rode out from Mill Creek, a preacher, a merchant, and a former sheriff, men too proud to admit their fear. They crossed the frozen creek at dusk, their horses snorting at the scent that drifted through the air, damp earth and something sweetly foul, like rotting fruit. When they reached the house, the door hung open. Inside, dust floated through shafts of gray light. Furniture overturned. The grand piano cracked in half. Not a soul answered when they called. The preacher was the first to see the footprints, small ones, scattered through the entry hall. They led upward toward the nursery. But the merchant refused to follow. "That room's cursed," he muttered, crossing himself. "They say she's still there." The sheriff laughed, but softly. "Ghosts don't frighten me. Dead men do." When they reached the nursery, the air turned heavy, sour. The mirror stood uncovered, its surface dark as oil. The cradle sat in the corner, rocking faintly though no wind stirred. The preacher whispered a prayer. Then, on the far wall, he noticed something carved into the plaster. Words written by a trembling hand. "He sleeps below." The sheriff descended into the cellar, lantern trembling in his grip. The steps creaked under his weight. When the flame touched the floor, he froze. There were mounds, dozens, small, uneven, each one marked by a crude wooden cross. But it wasn't the graves that made him drop the lantern. It was what lay between them. A skeleton, adult, tall, with one arm reaching upward as if clawing for air. Around its wrist clung fragments of fabric, the fine weave of a gentleman's coat. The sheriff stumbled back. "Dear God," he whispered. "It's him." From above, the preacher shouted, "What did you find?" But before he could answer, the mirror upstairs shattered, a sound sharp enough to pierce the soul. When they fled the house, none looked back. The preacher claimed he saw her silhouette in the upstairs window, holding something in her arms. The merchant said it wasn't a child at all, but a bundle of rags that breathed. The sheriff never spoke of that day again. Weeks later, when the county clerk sealed the property, he wrote only 3 words on the report: house unfit, occupied. If you were them, would you have returned to tell the town what you saw? By the spring of 1839, the Darrow Plantation had become a story whispered in low voices at taverns and churchyards. Farmers crossed themselves when they passed its boundaries, and mothers warned their children never to wander near the cotton rows after sundown. They called it Darrow's Field now, not a place, but a curse. The land was auctioned twice that year. Both buyers vanished within months. The first man, a banker from Savannah, lasted 3 weeks before his servants found him wandering barefoot along the creek, muttering about children singing in the walls. The second, a tobacco merchant, moved in with his wife and infant daughter. On the 12th night, the baby's cradle was found empty, its sheets folded neatly, a faint handprint pressed into the wood. After that, no one would buy it. The county boarded the doors, yet travelers swore they saw lights flickering inside, soft blue, like candle flames underwater. Those who came close enough claimed to hear a lullaby drifting from the fields, the same few words repeated over and over. Sleep, little one, he can't hurt you now. Time turned the tragedy into legend. They said Evelyn Darrow still walked the house at night, her pale dress brushing the floor, her voice soothing the restless souls her husband had made. Some said she had become their mother in death, others their keeper, and if anyone dared to call her name aloud near the property, the wind would answer with a whisper, faint, childlike, "We remember." The soil itself changed. Crops withered within days. Horses refused to cross the fence line. Hunters who strayed too near spoke of hearing babies crying in the mist, and once a boy swore he saw small handprints appear on the inside of a window that hadn't been cleaned in decades. By 1850, the Darrow name had been erased from county records, though no one knew by whose order. The old plantation house stood hollow, its roof sagging, its porch covered in moss. Yet somehow, the nursery window remained intact, spotless as if someone still wiped it clean from inside. On moonless nights, travelers along the river road said they saw a lantern moving through the fields, slow, steady, and a woman's voice humming just out of earshot. Those who tried to follow it vanished before dawn. To this day, the land remains untouched. Even the grass grows differently there, thin, pale, almost white, and every few years a child in the nearby town wakes crying, saying they dreamed of a woman whispering, "Don't be afraid, he's gone now." Would you dare spend one night in Darrow's Field just to see if she's still there? Nearly a century later, when the 20th century crept over Georgia's red soil, the Darrow Plantation still stood, blackened, skeletal, and alive. The locals avoided the old road that curved past its gates. They said the air there moved strangely, as if the earth itself was exhaling. No birds nested in its rafters. No weeds dared to grow against its walls. In 1932, a historian from Atlanta named Samuel Greaves arrived, drawn by the silence that surrounded the legend. He had heard the stories, the barren wife, the missing master, the children buried beneath the east wing. He did not believe them. His purpose, he said, was truth. His companion, a photographer named Ellis, noted in his journal that the moment they stepped through the doorway, the air felt thick, as if entering someone's lungs. The house was still standing, though barely. The nursery remained untouched. Dust floated like ash in the gray light filtering through cracked shutters, and there, against the far wall, stood the mirror, whole, polished, waiting. Greaves stepped toward it, murmuring, "Remarkable preservation," and wiped its surface with his sleeve. What he saw made him stumble backward. For in the reflection, the room was not abandoned at all. It was alive, warm, flickering with candlelight. A woman in white rocked a cradle. Children moved around, her laughing without sound. and standing in the doorway behind them was a tall figure with no face, watching. When Ellis developed the photograph days later, the same scene appeared. Faint but unmistakable. The woman, the children, the cradle. But where Greaves had stood, there was only a shadow. Stretched long, almost human, reaching toward the lens. They returned to Atlanta shaken. Greaves tried to publish his findings, but the negatives were confiscated by the county historical office for preservation. He fell ill soon after. Fever, delirium, whispers of children calling his name at night. In his final note, scrawled before he died, he wrote only, "The house still breathes. The floor moves when no one walks. And she is waiting for someone to listen." Decades passed. The land was reclaimed by the forest, yet the locals say the house remains, not gone, merely hidden by trees that twist in unnatural ways. On still nights, hunters claim they hear the faint cry of infants drifting through the fog. Others see a woman's shape in the upstairs window, swaying gently as though rocking something that was never hers, and never his. Some say the Darrow plantation was damned by cruelty. Others believe it was claimed by justice older than any man's God. But those who have stood near its crumbling gate swear the same thing. If you stand long enough, the house breathes, slow, patient, alive. Would you walk through that door, knowing something inside still remembers its master?